Welcome back to 1:35 a.m. This is part 3. I'll admit I read ahead a little bit, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss this. So let's continue. The next night, Delilah started in the bathtub, and still Ella found her. At 1:35 a.m., Delilah heard something creeping through the pipes under the tub. Sure Ella's hand was going to burst through the porcelain and grab her, Delilah had scrambled out of the tub and into the corner of the bathroom, against the door, where she spent the next few hours trying to breathe. She didn't even attempt to sleep. At 5:35 a.m., Delilah got dressed and went over to the diner. Nate, as she knew he would be, was baking biscuits and cinnamon rolls. "What are you doing here?" he asked, when she stepped into the kitchen. "I thought putting you on the same shift all the time had eliminated your time confusion. Now you're showing up for shifts you're not on instead of being late for ones you are on." Nate chopped biscuit dough into neat squares and began throwing them into perfectly straight lines on a massive baking sheet. The diner smelled gloriously ordinary. Coffee aromas mingled with the scents of buttermilk and cinnamon. The sounds were comfortingly normal, too. A couple of their early regulars were discussing the weather at the counter. One of the servers was whistling. The walk-in refrigerator hummed. "I need you to put me on night," Delilah said to Nate. Nate stopped in mid-throw. He turned and raised both eyebrows. "Are you messing with me?" Delilah shook her head. "I'm having trouble sleeping at night. It's a thing. I figure if I work nights, I can sleep during the day. I know Grace hates managing the night shift. She'd be happy to trade with me, I'm sure." "You're a better manager. I like having you here when it's busy." "Thanks." That wasn't a compliment. It was a state of fact and a complaint. "You're just a teddy bear under all that bluster," Delilah said. It was true. Nate complained about every employee and every customer in the diner in general, and he loved them all. "You tell anyone and I'll have to kill you." Delilah mimed zipping her mouth shut. Nate sighed. "Okay, switch, but do what you can to work on the thing." "Thanks. Be here at 10, and do not be late. I'm going to buy two new alarm clocks right now." "Good girl." Delilah didn't know why she didn't think of it before. How could Ella plague Delilah at 1:35 a.m. if Delilah was already awake at that time? There was no way Ella could sneak up on Delilah at the restaurant, so all Delilah had to do was work nights until Ella ran out of juice or whatever. Problem solved. Even though Delilah had never liked the night shift when she worked it before, she was so buoyed by her plan to be free of Ella that she went to work in the best mood she'd been in for a long time. She was so upbeat that when she clocked in at 9:55 p.m. that Glenn, the night shift cook, asked her if she was all right. "Freedom, Glenn," she said. "This is what freedom looks like." "Weird is what you look like," he said, but he grinned to let her know he didn't hold it against her. Glenn was a huge guy with a gut that sometimes caught fire when he hung it over the grill. In spite of his size, he was energetic. She thought he was pretty young, maybe in his 20s. He had a baby face, chin-length sideburns, and kind brown eyes. She liked working with him. For 3 hours and 39 minutes, Delilah felt great, letting a couple of the old guys flirt with her. She didn't even mind the couples, the ones who came in after late shows, the ones who used to make her feel desperately alone. At 1:34 a.m., Delilah stepped into the walk-in refrigerator to grab some cheese and some lettuce. For some reason, salads were popular tonight. She was just bending over to reach for the cheddar when she heard an alarm going off in the kitchen. Rising up, she whacked her head on the shelf above her. She ignored the pain and looked at her watch. It was 1:35 a.m. Tearing out of the walk-in, Delilah spun in a circle in the kitchen. "Where's that coming from?" she shouted. Glenn looked up from the grill. Jackie, the night server, dropped a plate and stared at Delilah with wide blue eyes. "Where's what coming from?" Glenn asked. "That." The alarm was similar to the torture device that Gerald had used. It was the same ringing, buzzing, shrieking undulation. Delilah ran for the deep fryer and looked at its controls. No, it wasn't going off. She checked the ovens. They weren't even being used. She tore into the employee break room. No, the sound wasn't coming from in there. It was out in the kitchen. Delilah returned to the middle of the stainless steel maze and began searching through pots, pans, and utensils. She didn't do it neatly or methodically, and when she tossed her third pan, Glenn grabbed her arm. "Hey, Lady Delilah, you trippin'?" "What?" Delilah wrestled her arm from Glenn's grasp. "No, don't you hear—" The sound stopped. Delilah tilted her head and listened, but all she could hear now were the normal diner noises. She looked at Glenn and at Jackie, who was still staring like Delilah had just turned into an elephant. "You two didn't hear that?" she asked. Heard you shouting and throwing pans around, Glenn said. Delilah looked at Jackie. A year or two younger than Delilah, and still unsure of herself, Jackie wore bright blue glasses. The lenses made her eyes look huge with shock. Jackie shook her head. I didn't hear anything. I mean, other than, you and the usual, stuff. This couldn't be happening. How could Ella have followed Delilah over here? Well, why couldn't she follow Delilah over here? Hadn't Ella already demonstrated that she could do pretty much whatever she wanted? Which was crazy. This was just technology gone awry, right? You gonna be okay? Glenn asked. Delilah shook her head. Yeah. And she figured she would be. At least she didn't have to try to go to sleep with her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Glenn and Jackie could hear it and were just being too polite to say so. So her plan hadn't worked, but the upside was she could use her adrenaline-driven energy surge for work instead of trying to fight it so she could go to sleep. And maybe tomorrow night, because she was prepared for the alarm sound now, she could ignore it and get on with her shift. Maybe her new plan would work after all. On the second night shift, Delilah made sure she wasn't alone at 1:35 a.m. She stuck close to Glenn, which he didn't seem to mind, but in spite of being with him, she still lost it. She couldn't help it. Tonight, for the first time, she hadn't just heard or sensed something. She'd seen something. She'd seen a flash of bright blue in the walk-in when Jackie opened the door. When she saw what she was sure was Ella coming out of the walk-in, Delilah screamed and pressed against Glenn. He didn't seem to mind that either, but he obviously asked why she was screaming. She had no answer for him. At 1:30 a.m., the third night of Delilah's switch to night shift, Delilah was behind the counter. She decided the way to make sure nothing spooked her tonight was to stay out here in the open, well away from the walk-in. When Mrs. Jeffrey, the rice-pudding regular, came into the diner, Delilah was thrilled. She could serve Mrs. Jeffrey, and 1:35 a.m. would just go on by. Hi, Delilah. Mrs. Jeffrey took a seat on one of the swiveling, padded counter stools. Her eyes were puffy. Delilah leaned on the counter. Hey, Mrs. Jeffrey. Having trouble sleeping? Mrs. Jeffrey patted her tousled hair. I suppose it's obvious. I do hope you still have some rice pudding left. Absolutely. I'll just... Delilah stopped. She looked over her shoulder. Then she glanced at the clock. It was 1:33 a.m. Where was Jackie? No way did Delilah want to go back into the walk-in. She was sure Ella would be in there waiting for her. Jackie? She called. No answer. Jackie! It came out as a bellow. Glenn stuck his head out of the kitchen. Is there a problem? Delilah tried to calm her breathing. She was building up to a full-blown anxiety attack, and she didn't want to have one of those in front of her customer and co-workers. Delilah looked at Mrs. Jeffrey. The elderly woman's brown eyes were wide. Sorry, Delilah said. It's just... She stopped when the counter stool next to Mrs. Jeffrey started spinning back and forth. She blinked, and she realized Ella was on the stool. Ella was playing on the stool. Stop it! Delilah clambered over the counter and grabbed the stool. That's when Jackie entered the dining room. Delilah glanced at Jackie, and she realized she was sprawled all over the counter, her butt up in the air. No wonder Jackie was gawking at her, open-mouthed. Are you all right, dear? Mrs. Jeffrey asked. Delilah slid off the counter. You didn't see the doll on the stool? Doll? That's my purse, dear. Mrs. Jeffrey patted a bright blue purse, which sat on the stool next to her. Delilah backed away from the counter. She checked the clock. Of course it was 1:35 a.m. The next night, something similar happened. Delilah stayed in the dining room, but she was still traumatized at 1:35 a.m. when she saw something moving around in the trash bin under the counter. Wanting to believe it was a mouse, even though that would have been horrible for the diner, she'd used a fork to search the rubbish. She didn't find a mouse, but she spotted a pink ruffle that made her drop the fork and jump back. She resisted the urge to scream, but she hadn't been able to resist the urge to hurl the trash bin out the back door of the diner, scattering trash, but no Ella, who, as usual, had instantly moved on, all over the pavement. Delilah just couldn't contain her reactions. She knew Glenn and Jackie were watching her, but that wasn't enough to keep her calm. It was the fifth night of night shift that did Delilah in. Even though it hadn't worked so well yet, Delilah still thought the safest place for her in the diner was the main dining room. She did her best to avoid closed-in places like the walk-in, the supply room, and Nate's office. At 1:30 a.m. on the fifth night, the diner was empty of customers. Delilah and Jackie were filling the small glass salt and pepper containers. Delilah had salt, Jackie had pepper. They had the tray of containers set up at a table by the diner's front window, and they sat on opposite sides of the table. While they worked, Jackie chattered about her college classes. Delilah tried to pay attention, but she was mentally counting down the minutes and seconds to 1:35 a.m. What was it going to be tonight? Every muscle and joint in Delilah's body was stiff with dread. But when Delilah spotted something bright blue flutter through the parking lot in front of the diner, her muscles and joints released and went into action. She jumped up, knocking the tray of salt and pepper shakers onto the floor with a loud crash, and she sprinted out the diner's front door. Rushing through the nearly empty parking lot, she scanned for Ella's dress. She was sure that was what she had seen. She had seen the trailing edge of Ella's fluffy dress. The doll was out there. She'd been watching Delilah. When she didn't see Ella, Delilah started looking under the 2 parked cars at the edge of the lot. She was bending to check under the first one when someone grabbed her shoulder. She screamed. Okay, you're okay." It was Glenn. His face looked pale in the mottled light. "Did you see her?" Delilah asked. "See who?" She looked into Glenn's eyes. He was so sympathetic and concerned. Delilah crumpled into Glenn's arms and started to cry. Delilah thought it was pretty amazing that she'd gotten through 23 nights of 1:35 a.m. horror without crying. In fact, she hadn't even noticed that she didn't cry. But once she started crying, she couldn't stop. She cried so much that after Glenn got her inside, he called Nate and asked him to come in. Nate arrived as Jackie was sweeping up broken glass from the diner floor. While Delilah sat in a back booth and tried to get her body to stop twitching, Nate talked to Glenn and Jackie. She couldn't hear what they said, but she figured she should say something on her own behalf. She stood. "Come with me," Nate said. Good. He was taking her to his office. She could explain things there. Or not. As soon as they entered his office, Nate closed the door behind him. "I'm sorry, Delilah. I have to let you go." Delilah looked at Nate with wide eyes that felt bruised and lacerated. "Don't look at me like that." Nate went around to his desk and dropped into his leather chair. Delilah twisted her mouth and tried not to whimper. "I've cut you all kinds of slack for being late. I've worked around your thing, but this is too much. Jackie says you've been acting super weird." He gave the words air quotes the last 4 nights. "And now this? I can't keep an employee who freaks out the customers and breaks trays full of salt and pepper shakers." "Nate, Don't even try to give me a sob story. I'm not your father. Whatever you have going on that made you do what you did tonight is something you need to work out on your own, outside this diner. You're a good worker when you're here and focused, but I can't afford the liability risks of you acting like this." He rubbed his beard. "I'll have someone bring you your last check tomorrow." Delilah stood in front of Nate's scarred old desk and looked at all its neat little piles. She turned. She wasn't going to beg for the job. As she left the diner, she wasn't even thinking about the job. She was thinking about Ella. Every night was getting worse. How was she going to get through another 1:35 a.m.? When Richard had asked Delilah to move out of his parents' guest house, she'd had no place to go, so she'd gone to Harper. Harper welcomed her with open arms, but unfortunately, Harper lived in a house with 10 other struggling actors. All Harper had to offer was half a double bed-size mattress on the floor of what once was a massive walk-in closet. Massive for a closet, not so much for a place to sleep. Harper loved her retreat. She got the bed, and she got to organize all her clothes on the racks and the shelves of the closet. Delilah hated the tiny space. It gave her claustrophobia. Plus, Harper snored and talked in her sleep. Delilah had only stayed with Harper 3 days before getting her apartment with the money Richard had given her. So it said a lot about her state of mind that she called Harper when she got home from work and asked if she could stay with Harper for a few nights. "Sure thing," Harper said. "We'll have a slumber party. You won't even know 1:35 a.m. has come and gone." Delilah wanted to believe that was true. She tried to believe it. Harper was performing that evening, as she did 6 evenings a week, so she left Delilah in the care of one of her housemates, a funky guy named Rudolph, who spent the afternoon and evening teaching Delilah the card game he'd created. She never did fully understand it, but she had to admit it was entertaining. Rudolph was funny and nice, too. By the time Harper got home at about 12:30 a.m., Delilah was surprisingly relaxed. "Okay," Harper said, dragging Delilah away from a disappointed Rudolph. "You don't get to keep her as a pet, Rudy," she chastised. He stuck out his lower lip, then grinned at Delilah as Delilah followed Harper to the second floor of the house. "I have munchies," Harper said. "The salty kind. Guaranteed to keep away snarky high-tech dolls." Delilah's stomach did a somersault at the word doll. Harper led Delilah into her bedroom. threw several bags and boxes of chips and crackers on the mattress, and then said, "I need to go wash off the face paint. Be right back." Delilah sat on the mattress, opened a box of cheese crackers, and nibbled on one. Her stomach continued to do gymnastics. When Harper returned, she entertained Delilah with stories about that evening's performance. "So, first, Manny forgot his line, and then he said my line," Harper said as she tore into a bag of barbecue potato chips. "Imbecile. I had to think fast, so I kissed him." "Was that in character?" "My character's kind of a doodlebug, so pretty much anything is in character." Delilah looked at her watch. It was 12:55 a.m. "Hey, did you just look at your watch?" Harper grabbed Delilah's arm. "Give me that." Delilah didn't resist when Harper took off Delilah's watch and stuffed it under a pillow. She didn't need it anyway. She'd know when 1:35 a.m. came. No watch. No 1:35 a.m. Harper wiped her hands in a "that's that" gesture. Delilah wanted it to be that easy. But it wasn't. She knew exactly when 1:35 a.m. rolled around. She knew because suddenly a voice said, "It's time." Delilah jumped up and hit her head on the rack above her bed. "What are you doing?" Harper asked. At the same time, Delilah ducked her head under the rack and said, "Did you do that?" Then they both spoke at the same time again. "What do you mean?" Delilah said. "Do what?" Harper said. They both stopped. Delilah could still hear Gerald's voice in her ear repeating, "It's time," in a receding echo. Delilah looked at Harper. "Do you hear that?" Harper frowned up at Delilah. "I don't hear anything except Raoul's oldies music and the movie Kate and Julia are watching downstairs." "You didn't just mimic Gerald?" "I'm sitting right here in front of you. I'm eating potato chips. How could I have mimicked Gerald?" Harper popped a chip into her mouth with deliberate emphasis. She chewed loudly. Delilah shook her head. She realized she was shivering. She had to clench her teeth together to keep them from chattering. "Then you must have Ella." "What?" Delilah's neck was starting to hurt from her contorted position under the closet rack, and her legs felt weak. She sank onto the bed. "You know what Gerald sounds like." "So?" "So you could program Ella to sound like him, record yourself mimicking him or something." Harper shoved aside the chips bag and leaned toward Delilah. "I want to be sure I understand what you're saying." She narrowed her eyes. "You're saying I took your wacky doll and somehow got her to work, and I recorded my impression of Gerald on the doll so I could play that for you. That's what you're saying." Delilah shook her head. "No?" Harper asked. "Then what are you saying?" "That is what I'm saying. You're just crazy is what you're just. I don't have the stupid doll. I never saw the stupid doll. If I had seen the doll and taken the doll, I sure wouldn't have recorded something on it to scare you. Why would I do that?" "I don't know." Delilah looked at her hands. She felt a little stupid. Why would Harper do that? Then she remembered the voice she heard. But who else could have done it? "You tell me," Delilah said. "Why did you do it?" "I didn't do it," Harper shouted. Delilah flinched. Then she whispered, "But there's no other explanation." Harper stared at Delilah. "Geez, Del, you're losing it, girl." She shoved the junk food off the bed and curled up on her side with her back to Delilah. "I'm going to sleep." "I wish I could." "You could," Harper said. "Just get out of your head. It's not me, it's Ella." Harper sighed, then started breathing deeply and evenly. "Must be nice," Delilah muttered. The next day, Delilah spent most of the day hanging out with Harper and her housemates. Because she didn't fall asleep until almost 7 a.m., and Harper woke her up when she got up at about 10 a.m., Delilah was fuzzy with sleep deprivation. She felt like someone had stuffed her brain with cotton candy. When she got up, Harper seemed either to have forgotten Delilah's accusations or forgiven them. She didn't say anything about what had happened between them, and she was her usual vivacious self all day. Delilah decided not to say anything else about Ella. She also decided, though, that she wasn't staying here tonight. She'd leave while Harper was at the theater. She didn't know until she walked out to her car at 4:35 p.m. where she was going. It came to her in a flash of brilliant insight. She'd go to a motel on the other side of the town. Ella wouldn't be able to find her there. Delilah didn't think anyone else, like Harper, would be able to find her there, either. She wasn't going to use an assumed name or anything, but Harper didn't process things in the sort of organized way that she'd think to do, a search of motels and find out if her friend was staying there. So, at 6:15 p.m., after Delilah ate a burger and fries at a fast food place, she checked into the Bed for You motel on the outskirts of the scruffier side of town. The quality level of the hotel was evident at both its name and the fact that its fading sign announced a bed and a TV in every room. Talk about luxury, Delilah said, when she parked her car over weeds growing through cracks in the time-worn asphalt. The price was right, though. Trying not to breathe in smells of bleach and stewed cabbage in the hotel's small brown lobby, Delilah paid for 3 nights. She was happy that the total barely made a dent in the credit limit on her one credit card. She was also happy that she got a room at the far end of the low, long building in the back, away from the traffic. The heavy woman behind the desk wasn't interested in Delilah at all. She was too busy watching a documentary about spiders on an old TV mounted on the wall next to the check-in counter. The old hotel room was surprisingly neat and clean. Done in the same ugly brown tones Delilah had found in the lobby, the room wouldn't win any beauty prizes, but it smelled fresh, and everything worked. The bed was even comfortable. Because the only other surfaces in the room suitable for sitting were a couple of straight-backed cloth-covered chairs, Delilah plopped on the bed as soon as she bolted through the door and set her stuff on the low bureau across from the bed. She was pleased to discover the motel was pretty well insulated. The traffic on the busy road in front of the motel was just a distant shh, and Delilah couldn't hear anything else. She'd thought she might watch some TV when she got in the room, but she was so tired she risked lying back on the pillow. Tense, expecting the usual panic attack symptoms, she was thrilled when she felt nothing but exhaustion. She closed her eyes, and sleep took her from the motel room into the promise, or portent, of her dreams. The sound crept through her sleep like a spider crawling through her synapses and leaving silken trails along her neural pathways. It was a scuffing sound, like something scooting over a rough surface. Her mind couldn't make enough sense of it to integrate it into her dream about riding horses. So the horse in her dream threw her off, and she came face to face with a spider. She screamed, and the scream slung her back into consciousness. Delilah's eyes opened, and she realized she was still screaming. She pressed her lips together and bit her tongue. She wanted to get up and run, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed. Wait, was she awake? She thought she was. Above her, something crawled on the roof. It made a similar sound to the one in her dream, but this sound was worse. It wasn't just the sound of some spider going about its business. This was a strategic sound. It started, it stopped, it moved here, it moved there. It was a searching sound, a seeking sound. It was the sound of something with an objective. And Delilah knew she was the objective. Ella had found Delilah. She was looking for a way into the motel room. Whining like a kitten being hunted by a coyote, Delilah struggled to free her limbs from whatever force held her immobile. But she was still pinned to the bed. The only thing she could do was move her head. So she turned her head and looked at the digital clock on the bedside table. It read, of course, 1:35 a.m. As soon as Delilah saw the time, she discovered she could move. She thrashed free of the bedspread, which she'd managed to wrap around herself in her sleep. She jumped from the bed and crouched against the wall by her door, her gaze riveting on the ceiling. Flashing dark red light from a neon sign next door to the motel splayed across the ceiling like blood splatter. It was sporadically illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lamps that lit up the motel walkways and parking lots. This meant Delilah could see what she needed to see. Nothing was coming through the ceiling. But that didn't comfort her. Ella had other ways to get into the room, and even if she didn't get into the room, the very fact that she was outside the room, on the roof, meant that Delilah's brief respite was over. There was no getting away from Ella. Delilah began rocking back and forth like a child, and she hummed until daylight broke. She didn't know what she was humming at first, but then she recognized the tune. She was humming the old lullaby her mom used to sing for her when she was little. Even though Delilah had paid for 3 nights, she left the motel room about noon the next day. There was no point in staying. She couldn't sleep. She wasn't safe there. She was pretty sure she wasn't safe anywhere, but Delilah figured being mobile wasn't a bad idea. This assumed, though, that Ella's circuits hadn't noted the make, model, color, and maybe even the license plate of Delilah's car. Ella had, after all, ridden to the apartment in the car. She probably had left some sort of tracker on it. Delilah's travels were no doubt a pointless waste of time and gasoline. But what else could Delilah do? So she drove. She drove all afternoon and all evening. She drove all over the city, exploring neighborhoods she hadn't known existed. She gazed longingly at big family homes and children playing in the park. She cruised the shopping district, remembering what it was like to be able to buy whatever she wanted, and also remembering how little pleasure that had given her. She'd never wanted things. She wanted love. When the sun started going down a little after 6, Delilah realized she was being stupid. Very stupid. Why was she staying in the city? Why not get out of town, drive out and into the country? Wouldn't it be harder for Ella to reach her there? Delilah turned a busy corner and pointed her car toward the freeway. Then she immediately turned again, looping back into the neighborhood she'd just left. Maybe she wasn't being stupid after all. What if the city was helping to keep her safe? What if Ella would be free to do whatever she wanted to do to Delilah if they were away from a populated area? Besides, in the country it was dark. Very dark. Delilah had only one small flashlight. She didn't think she could stand facing 1:35 a.m. in the pitch dark. No, she'd stay in town. But where? Pulling into the drive-thru of a fast food burrito place, Delilah bought a chicken and rice burrito with sour cream. Weirdly, even though she was so scared she was probably just one more shock from full-blown hysteria, she still had her appetite. Maybe her body knew she needed nutrition to handle what was coming her way. Delilah ate her burrito at a drive-in movie theater she discovered on the west edge of the city. She had no idea it was there. She was happy to find it, though. It kept her awake until nearly midnight. That's when the last movie, a chase-scene-heavy action flick, ended, and Delilah had to join the ragged line of cars straggling out of the drive-in. That's when she had to decide where she would be when 1:35 a.m. came around. She'd thought about parking her car behind a dark building or in a quiet neighborhood near an occupied house, but did she really want to make it that easy for Ella to get to her? No. It would be better if she was driving around at 1:35 a.m. She'd never tried that before. Maybe that was the trick. So, as her limbs got more jittery and her breath came faster, and her lungs got tighter, Delilah drove closer and closer to the city center. She wanted to be where people still meandered down the sidewalks and bright lights turned night into day. At 1:33 a.m., Delilah had an even more inspired idea. She'd drive onto one of the big bridges. Surely Ella couldn't get to her there, especially since the decision to hit the on-ramp to the bridge was as spontaneous as you could get. Even though it was the middle of the night, at least a dozen cars were on the bridge. Delilah's hands sweated, and as she repositioned them on the steering wheel, she blinked several times to clear her vision, which was becoming blurry. She concentrated on the road and forced herself not to look at her dashboard digital clock. But she knew when 1:35 a.m. arrived. She knew because that's when she heard her passenger door unlock and unlatch. Gasping and losing control of the car for an instant, Delilah turned the wheel to get back in her lane. The whooshing sound of wind came through the open passenger door to hit her just before she heard the passenger door slam closed again. She glanced to her right, her whole body charged with terror. She fully expected to see Ella sitting in the car next to her, but nothing was there. All she saw in her car was a bag of fast food, trash, her purse, and her flashlight. Almost across the bridge, she put her gaze back on the road. Then something hit the roof of her car with a thunk. Delilah screamed and jammed her foot onto the accelerator. Her car scooted forward and she pulled it out to pass a minivan, barely missing its back bumper. She then jerked her car back into the right lane so she could take the first exit off the bridge. Driving like a madwoman, Delilah careened into the industrial road running parallel to the river and pulled over when she reached a boarded-up factory. Her car skidded to a stop, spraying gravel. Delilah had the engine off and was out of the car the minute the vehicle stopped moving. She didn't bother to lock it up. She just grabbed her purse and her flashlight, slammed the driver's door behind her, and ran. She ran toward the river, behind the factory. Her feet crackling over crumbling concrete and trash, she ran until she was hidden from the road. Her car was no longer in sight either. Delilah could still see where she was going because the factory, though empty, was well lit. She stopped running and looked around. She had no idea where she was, but she didn't feel safe. Where would she ever feel safe again? Turning in a full circle, she scanned her surroundings. Maybe if she could hide from Ella now, the doll wouldn't find her. But where could she hide? Delilah spotted a drainage pipe at the far side of the factory. It was huge, maybe 4 feet in diameter. She could crawl into that easily. Striding across a dirt and gravel lot filled with potholes, Delilah headed toward the drainage pipe. But halfway there, she stopped. She couldn't take her purse with her. She couldn't take anything with her. She didn't know what linked her to Ella. Turning in another circle, Delilah saw a stack of railroad ties. That should work. She checked her surroundings again. She was still alone. She ran over to the railroad ties and hid her purse in a crevice. Then she looked around once more and bolted over to the drainage pipe. She crawled inside and hunkered down. She realized she was lightheaded. She was hyperventilating. Leaning over, her head between her knees, she attempted to shorten her breaths, taking in less oxygen than she was sure she needed. She wished she had a paper bag. There was one in the car, but she couldn't go back there. She couldn't go back to any place she'd ever been before. She couldn't go back to her life. Ella was going to find her anywhere, even here. Delilah fell back onto her butt and curled up in a ball, hugging her legs close. She tried to stay silent, but she couldn't. She began to keen. The sound that came from her wasn't like any sound she'd made before. Not even when her parents died. Not even when her first foster home refused to keep her. Not even when her fourth foster dad beat her. Not even when Gerald scheduled when she could blow her nose. Not even when Richard threw her out. The sound contained every hurt and fear and crushing disappointment she'd ever had, all rolled into one screeching rejection of pain. The sound she made was the sound of a woman who had no strength left. She couldn't fight anymore. Delilah closed her mouth. Her throat hurt, her lungs hurt, her heart hurt, and she couldn't stop quaking. Her whole body was almost convulsing with apprehension. No, not apprehension. Delilah was so beyond any known version of fear that she didn't feel human anymore. She was never going to be safe again. Delilah sobbed as she got onto her hands and knees. She couldn't stay here. Ella would know where she was. Crawling as fast as she could, her hands stinging from the rough concrete surface chafing at her skin, Delilah clambered out of the drainage pipe. She stood. Where could she go? Delilah began to run again. She ran parallel to the river, scanning this way and that, looking for a way out, looking for an escape hatch, an ejection seat, something to take her as far away from Ella as she could get. She didn't know how long she ran before she stumbled into what looked like an abandoned construction site. Its lumpy outlines were shrouded by darkness, but street lamps sent enough light over it to reveal its basic outlines. She slowed her pace, aimed her flashlight, and studied the weathered sign announcing the project. It looked like an office complex. Shoving at a dirty board covering an opening in the side of what seemed to be a 3-story structure, Delilah sidled into the site. The answer to her plight was in there. She was sure of it. Someplace here she was going to find a way to escape Ella forever. But where? Picking her way over bare boards sprinkled with nails and screws, wading around stacks of lumber and drywall, Delilah made her way into a room that was nearly completed. The drywall wasn't just up. It was also textured and painted. And there, high up on the inside wall, was her answer. It was a vent opening, uncovered, barely big enough for her to slip into. That was the way. That was where she could stop running from Ella. Looking around the room for a way to boost herself up to the opening, she spotted an overturned sawhorse. She trotted over to it, righted it, and carried it to a spot below the vent. It was strong and stable. Stopping to listen, to be sure she was alone, Delilah hoisted herself onto the sawhorse, stood on her tiptoes, and was able to hook her hands over the front of the vent opening. From there, she did a pull-up, thankful for all the upper body strength she got from heavy cleaning at the diner. Once her head was level with the vent opening, she reached in with one arm, searching for some kind of handhold. She didn't find one, but her sweaty hands stuck to the metal enough to give her some purchase. She was able to wiggle her upper body into the vent opening by going one hand length at a time. Once she was that far into the vent, she just had to wiggle her whole body like a snake into the vent. But she still didn't feel safe. She stopped wriggling for a moment, taking stock. Turning on her flashlight, she spotted a downward turn in the vent. She inched toward it. Yes, this was it. Aiming her head down into the chute-like space, she scooted forward. A little farther. And a little farther. Her flashlight slipped from her sweaty hand and clinked against the metal vent walls as it dropped out of Delilah's reach. She heard it impact something with a sharp crack. It must have broken because the space went dark. Delilah's shoulders wedged her so tightly into the compact metal enclosure that she knew she'd finally found it. This was where Ella couldn't find her. No one would find her here. Trying to move just to be sure, she confirmed that she was stuck, completely and thoroughly stuck. Her breathing slowed. She relaxed. She couldn't move in any direction. She'd never have to run from Ella again. And that's the end of the first story in this book. It's really weird, obviously, and it's not scary in a normal way that these stories are. It's more of a psychological thing, I think, and I really like it. Next time I'm going to be reading Room for One More, the second story. Hopefully I'll be able to get that out, I don't know, tomorrow. And, you know, I've got the 2 other audiobooks before this on the channel as well, so if you want to read those as well, they're all there, and I'll be doing all of these. So, I'll see you then. Bye.